You who have not joined us live here before, my name is Paul Hitchcock, and I am a co-founder of Giant Jacks Media, which is an agency that helps other businesses and professionals to grow, focus on sales, marketing, branding. I also run education and development for a really busy and fantastic law firm called Barth Calderon, based out of Orange County, California. Asset protection, estate planning, business planning. Every week at this time, Thursdays, 1 o'clock California time, I have a live show. Sometimes it's my Wealth Protector TV brand. Sometimes it's the Giant TV brand. And today it's Wealth Protector TV. And really excited to have my colleague at Barth Calderon with us, Brent Honay, who is an expert attorney, asset protection, estate planning, business planning. Brent, welcome to the episode.
Thank you, Paul. Good to be here.
Yeah, and so we're just going to dive into this. I want to respect everybody's time. And before I hand it over to Brent, and we're going to get into asset protection for a business, is you'll notice on the screen there, for anybody that's interested in our shows or has questions about their planning, whether it's for the business, personal, asset protection, estate planning, business planning, learn more about what we do. But we've got a complimentary strategy session that'll get you one-on-one with Brent. And if you text Guard Assets, you're looking at it there on the screen, to that number, you will get an opportunity to schedule a time that works for you to get one-on-one with Brent. And no issue is too small or too big. So jumping into this, Brent, we're talking about asset protection. Obviously, it's beginning of the year here. A lot going on everywhere with planning, and asset protection for business is hugely important. So let's jump into that. What is, broadly speaking, asset protection for business, and what are some of the hot button issues going on?
Well, thanks for that, Paul. So basically, 2020 was a different year for all of us, coming out of that. Now we're moving on here and into the new year. And as a business owner, it is extremely important to be mindful of what's going on in the area of asset protection and protecting our critical assets that we have that we don't want to lose to lawsuit. Asset protection for business brings up the idea that there's different types of asset protection. Really, we have asset protection for our personal assets. We have asset protection for our business assets, and they're both important. It's important to button down everything properly with the business, just as it's important to make sure that those important assets that are personal assets, your home, maybe your real estate that you own, that's investment real estate, your stocks, bonds, cash, everything that you personally own, those should have structures around them as well so that they're properly protected. So business, asset protection is really everything we can do to make sure that the business itself is protected, so that if a problem happens either inside the business and starts wreaking havoc, or something happens to one of the owners of a business and they're getting sued and someone's trying to reach in and come after the business, making sure that we have the right tools in place prior to the problem to defend those things.
Yeah, and I've heard you talk a lot before about asset protection being part of big picture financial planning, where it's a piece that it's proactive planning before something happens and understanding what asset protection is. So it's really guarding yourself from some unforeseen liabilities. And I know you said there's 30 million lawsuits filed in the United States every year. So it's preemptive planning. Is that a great way to put it, Brent?
It's a great way to put it. It's certainly we do planning for people where they have issues that are already happening or in the process, and
right,
we can do planning around that too. But really, this preemptive planning, or this proactive planning, I would call it, where we're going in when the coast is clear, so to speak, and we're saying, hey, what can we legally do to make sure that we're working our butt off here, right? We're growing our empire. However we're doing that, we're busy doing that. We realize at some point the attack could come, and if it does, building all those things that we can do legally to put things in place before a problem happens.
But where does the attack come from? So you say something can happen to your business here in 2021. Where does liability come from if you own a business that you see every day?
It's all over the place. So lately, what we've seen a lot of are just various issues that are happening, bubbling up to the surface, inside of the business. So for example, with the shutdown we're all experiencing, right, with COVID, and businesses being, have under different rules. Some can open, some can't open, and there's this cluster of just different rules and regulations all over the place. And what can we do? What can't we do? What's safe for employees? What's not? All of that is generating all kinds of confusion. Business owner, what should we be doing? And so these are lawsuits that can be generated by your employees for various things. If they think the environment's not safe enough, or if they slip and fall and get hurt, which is an issue that we're always dealing with. Various issues inside the business. In addition to that, various issues that are happening outside the business, just kind of the random thing that happens in life. I mean, we live in a world where, we drive cars around all over the place. Some of us may have employees that drive cars around all over the place as a part of our business. But, if we're an owner of a business, if we're a partner in it, and, we get involved in a bad car accident, and then there's a lawsuit that comes from that, we then have to turn our eyes to, okay, is that business protected as well? It's those sorts of things that are commonplace. And right now we are really, as you said at the beginning, we're swamped. I mean, we have so much going on in the asset protection side, because I think people are waking up to the idea that with what we're going through right now, there's going to be a litigation, tsunami, let's call it, just a ton of litigation that's going to come from this. And because of that, now is the time to make sure, if there's a storm we feel is coming, let's batten down the hatches. Let's do some proactive planning. Let's just take a look at everything and make sure that it's good. That I would say.
Well, let me ask you a question on something. So, because you brought up inside and outside liability, which I think is interesting. Inside liability, something happens inside, the structure of the business, and it impacts the business. But the outside liability, which you mentioned, I don't think a lot of people understand that, where if something happens away from the business, like a fender bender that leads to some crazy person coming after you and filing a claim, or maybe you own a piece of rental property over here, and there's a tenant liability, and now they're coming after you, they can look at the business, Brent, and look down on it. That's the outside liability you're talking about?
Yeah, and it's a big area. So, I would say that's one of the areas that we would consider a blind spot area for most business owners. That we're all when we go into business, we know there's things that can happen in that business, and most of us would do what we can to make sure that, hey, if we have a problem from our business that happens one day, we may be risking some of our business assets. We're going into business, we understand that's a risk of it, but we don't necessarily want to put our house, our family residence on the line and everything else. So we build something to protect things from coming out, right? That's that inside out liability. But what if something happens and it's outside, and so it's a good way to learn stuff is by example. If you have a situation where let's say you're the owner of a company, here in California, and you have a bad day, you're involved in a wreck, and it's largely your fault, and maybe the insurance covers, maybe it doesn't, but the insurance, let's say it does cover, but there's still millions of dollars of liability that come your way because the insurance company, the insurance policy isn't big enough to cover all of it. So we see things like, accidents that could happen where, maybe somebody's distracted driving, they're on their cell phone, they're texting somebody, and then boom, they run over some people. Well, that's a horrible day, we would agree, for everybody. From an asset protection standpoint, though, the issue is that you're bringing up is, okay, when that happens, can the people that litigate, when they're coming after and collecting on your various assets for that judgment that they're winning, can they come after the business, and what can they do? And the answer to that really depends upon what kind of planning did they do beforehand. Do they have an entity that can defend against some of that stuff? So if you have, for example, a sole proprietorship or a partnership, guess what? They can come right after your business, seize the asset, shut you down, you're done. If you have a corporation, though, one thing that is really good for people to understand is that if you have a C Corp or an S Corp, you own your form of ownership in stock. And just like any stock, just like owning stock in Apple or Microsoft, that stock can be seized in the event of a judgment against you, whether it's if it's a personal judgment like what we're talking about. And at that point, we have a problem because your business you lose control of your company. Your company can be sold. That stock is sold. You're done.
It's unbelievable, because not too long ago, this was the end of last year, there was a scenario at the law firm where it was a real estate agent, married, husband, wife real estate agent, liability with her practice. There was something to do with, sold a multi-million-dollar home, and the buyer sued the real estate company and the real estate agent personally. It was a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. The husband owned shares in his own company, so he had stock in his company, and that was a scenario. Shed some light on that, Brent, where all of a sudden his business is getting looked at, the stock he owns is getting looked at because the wife had a liability over here. I mean, isn't that what you're talking about?
Yeah, it's that's taking it another step further in terms of, the thing I sketched out was the business owner himself or herself driving that car around. We live
Yeah.
in a community property state here, right, in California, and so what that means, what you're bringing to the surface here, Paul, is just, we need to understand, if we live in a community property state like we do, if we have a problem, everything that's a community property asset that we own, doesn't matter which spouse did it, it's all in one big community pot, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
so you're right. So let's say you have spouse of a person who owns a big company. It's we all know this, that people, when they're coming after our assets, they want to find out where the deepest pockets are, and so if it's a spouse with a community property asset that we're going after, we can go right after that person's business and use that to satisfy the judgment, unless we've done some pre-planning to stop that. What does that mean?
Right.
It means,
Right.
generally speaking, the procedure we would go through for that is to create an agreement between the spouses that clearly defines, that after this agreement, we own things 50-50 now, which is great. In the event of a split, if people decide to divorce at some point, no one's getting hurt. But what we're doing is we're saying, hey, half of our assets are going to be separate property of husband, half are going to be separate property of spouse. And for the business, we may even do that a little bit different if we're worried about somebody who's a high risk spouse versus a low risk spouse. But bottom line, you have some really great ways to mitigate damage that can happen if a problem is just focused in on one spouse, to make sure that you don't lose the business, as long as you do pre-planning like that and create those kind of
So
agreements.
that's a separate property agreement, which is used as an asset protection tool for husband and wife. So phenomenal. I've heard you talk about that before. Let me ask you this question. For a business owner, if they're an S Corp
Mhm.
and they can be an LLC,
Yep.
should they, and why should they? What's that tool all about?
I love that question. We talk, I'd say almost every day that comes up. And there's two things that that you just said there. One is, if they can do that, that means that maybe they can't do that. And so what does that mean? It means that we have some professions out here that aren't allowed to be an LLC. Your professionals out here. So doctors, lawyers, we hold out the ability to work with the public. We are restricted from just forming an LLC.
Right.
So for those sorts of folks, us included, doing law, we're even more at risk because we can't LLC our way out of anything. It's really important to have our personal asset protection in place. Make sure our home, our retirement accounts, all of our stuff is protected outside. Now, for those that can do it, which is the vast majority of businesses out there, we strongly recommend, if you've been set up as a S corporation, taking a look at the pros and cons of doing what we call a statutory reorganization, where we literally reorganize your company. Company name stays the same, but if you're XYZ Company Inc., you become XYZ LLC. And we would, if we're at it, we might as well, if we can't pick different law this time, let's pick law that's more protective of the business owner, right? Let's not just form this thing in California. Let's pick Delaware, for example. Let's pick Wyoming, Nevada. We have some choices here where we can form, and then we register it back in California, because we're here in California and we do that. But we're borrowing the law of that other state, which is great. By doing that, there's some benefits. The biggest benefit is that outside in liability that you brought up a moment ago.
Yeah.
Those car accidents, or those things where people are attacking us from the outside, or maybe your kids crashed our car and they're attacking us, that kind of thing. This changes the game. If we now have an LLC and the lawsuit comes toward the business, the remedy is different. No longer can somebody seize our stock, because we don't own stock in the company anymore. Now that person can still issue a charging order remedy against us. They can literally put the equivalent of a lien on profit distributions that we get out of the business, but that's much preferred to flat out having our stock seized. We lose control of the business, game over. At this point, there's no control of the company. You're still in control of your company. You're still running your business. Everything works as it should. and the matter can be settled, right?
So you can go from an S corp to an LLC and maintain your S election for tax purposes. So there's no adverse tax consequences from doing this.
Correct. So then that's usually what comes our way is, okay, that sounds great, Brent. That's something that I think we should do. We would agree that we want to be better protected against anything coming at us. We don't want to lose, control over our business ever, because that's our lifeblood. But what is the pain in the butt factor going to be? What do we have to go through to do that? And from a tax perspective, you're considered the same company, right? So
Right.
it's essentially, there are some documents that we file, but your S election stays the same S election. You're still taxing it the same way. It's the legal formation of your company that's changed. You're now an LLC with better protection than you were as a corporation. You're just taxing it the same way. And we need to, in the future, make sure we're holding that company out as LLC. We don't want to be calling ourselves Inc. anymore. So we need to update maybe a website and that kind of thing. But yeah, it's a great thing to do. It's minimal work, minimal cost, big
upside.
Protection.
Yeah, amazing tool. What about the idea of business owners holding a lot of cash in the corporation? Because I see this a lot of times as people are talking to, you and colleagues at the firm, they'll have a business, they'll have $1 million, couple $1 million sitting in the corporation, cash. Isn't that low hanging fruit for, a creditor or liability that's emanates from the business? I mean, what would you do with that cash position? How do you get protected?
Yeah, so that's another thing that we're talking about. The simple answer is get it out, right? Get it out of the business. It doesn't need to be there. So it's different if we're talking about working capital, that business, that money that we need to run the day-to-day business. But what we see a lot of that comes in, when we do an analysis and we take a look at what's everybody have and where are your assets at. One of the key learnings that that we want to get out there is we all have these assets that I would consider to be hot assets and cold assets, right? The hot assets are things that can sue you, your business, right? Your rental property, those kind of things. The lawsuits come out of them all the time. Your cold assets, things that can't sue you, your cash, your money in the bank, your stocks, your bonds, your investments, those things can't sue you. So we need to not bundle them up in the same box, but separate them. And that means if you've got an extra million or two or whatever, that doesn't need to be there in the business. Make sure that is removed from the business. Take a distribution. Talk to the tax person. Make sure that's not going to be a taxable event for you, and get that out. And then take that, and now that it's a personal asset, do some good old-fashioned personal asset protection, and put a box around that. That means setting up
What would you do?
A stocks, bonds, and cash LLC to have that out of harm's way. It's now separated. It's somewhere else. It's now protected from things that come at you personally as well as from the business. It's a great move to make. Just make sure that LLC is properly structured. That is not a flimsy, cheaply designed California LLC that doesn't have everything in it that we would say you should have.
So you can put an LLC around stocks, bonds, and cash, and it run it like your family business.
You can. People do it all the time, and it's for the purpose of managing your wealth, right? Your portfolio. Yeah. Great thing to do, because if we have what we're getting at here is if we have a problem that arises within the business, why do we want to have extra money inside of the business that can be used to settle we don't, right? We want to get it out, and we want to get it out before a problem arises. It's asset protection 101. There's a lot we can do before a problem happens, before we have issues. And the key is to do the planning while things are good, rather than waiting for the problem to come on us.
Brent, what do you see when you have a business owner who's got a business partner? And aren't they exposed to each other's liabilities? And what are some of the pitfalls business partners need to look out for? And what are the best practices, how they should be, structured together when you own a business with somebody else?
That's a good question. So, from a starting point, what we find with business owners is we go into business with a partner or various partners, and everything is rosy at the beginning, right? And the issue is, you kind of go in all giddy. Hey, here's the things we're going to do. We're going to grow the business. This is the business plan. This is what we're going to do, and that's wonderful. And then hopefully things work out exactly the way that you want to, and you're making lots and lots of money. However, at the beginning, preferably, or if not in place, at the beginning, no time like the present, you should create agreements with everybody in terms of what happens if one of us, that's a partner in this business, gets divorced. What then? What if one of
Right.
the partners ends up embezzling money? What then? How do we handle that? What if one of the partners wants to retire one day? How is all that happening? How are we calculating what they get? What's fair to everyone? What if one of the partners dies or is disabled? All these different events that can happen through the course of a business need to be memorialized and need to be put into an agreement called the buy-sell agreement, right? And we put
Right.
things in there to make sure that everybody's on the same page. That if somebody, in the case you're bringing up here, if somebody acts as a bad partner, here's how we're going to have to handle that, and this is how you get cashed out, or here's the way we deal with that, versus just let's see what we do at that point and figure it out.
If your business partner has a liability, something's going on in their personal life. If you own a business with them, you each own stock in the business. Is it the case where their liability, which has nothing to do with the business, they have a kid or a spouse that has a liability, or they have a tax issue, or who knows what, you can be exposed to that, right? They have a liability. You mentioned divorce, but it could be any liability
Yeah.
that hits you because you're in business with them. Right?
Yes. So there's a lot of things we can do. At a beginning point, we should make sure that, what we're talking about there is, let's say that the partner has a problem, personally, they're getting sued personally, right?
Right.
It's the same thing we just discussed, as far as better to be in an LLC than to be in a corporation, because we would much rather have a situation where if that person's dealing with some things personally and they're going to get sued and it's going to impact, their ownership in your business, that judgment creditor, the person coming after them, is limited to just putting a lien on their profit distribution for just them, not for you necessarily. And that's much better than just, hey, now I am partnered up with the person who won in court, who wants nothing to do other than to just let's liquidate the business, that kind of thing. And that's what can happen if you're a corporation. But you also want to consider, taking things and dividing things into smaller boxes. Maybe you want to have a holding company. Maybe you want to hold your interest in the LLC in a separate business LLC, and the same with them, so that you've got further separation. There are various things we can do, but it all depends upon having that conversation, talking about it before there's a problem. Because once we have a problem, it's difficult to do some planning.
But what do you do when you own a business, you own stock in your business, privately held? How do you integrate that with your estate plan? Does that ownership interest get reflected in the living trust documents?
So it's a good question, and that's another area that I would say this is a big blind spot that we find quite a bit. The way I like to meet clients for the first time is not when there's a problem, not when there's an issue. And sometimes I get the good fortune to meet people as they're doing their estate planning, right? They're creating those very, very important documents to protect the family, and we are a firm that is known to be one of those places where if you're going to go and get your estate plan done or have it reviewed and beefed up, we treat that like the family constitution. So we want to make sure it's done right. What you're bringing up here is an issue that I would say comes up when we do what we call a beneficiary audit. We check to make sure that once we've created the trust, that all the different assets have been funded and actually are titled and directed towards that trust. One of the most common things we find is that the actual company, the company stock, let's say, is not linked up with the trust. It's basically just still in the person's name. There's no mention of the trust anywhere. And the problem is, for many of us, our business is our largest asset that we have.
Right. Yeah.
When we're doing our trust, there's no way we're thinking we want that business to go through probate. We don't want that to ever happen. And so it's a simple fix. It's a simple, let's create an assignment where we're assigning, the ownership interest in the company to the trust. That just needs to happen. And so you want to make sure that, if you're working with your trust lawyers, that they've done that. If you want to make sure that is actually the case and you don't know if it is or not, it's an easy fix. You just say, hey, Brent, hey, law firm, can you guys at Barth, can you just review our documents and make sure that we're correct? And we would go through that, make sure you're set up right, because that's often missed.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a big asset and missed, which is a big problem.
Definitely. So it's good to work when you work with lawyers, make sure that they understand asset protection, but also make sure they understand the estate planning, because estate planning, a lot of the things that we do overlap. If we're going in, we're helping with trust planning, not only are we worried about you, We're not only worried about you and your spouse and such in the business. We're worried about what happens when you're gone. What is the game plan, and how are we taking everything you've worked so hard to get and literally handing that to the next generation if that's where it's going next. We have
Yeah.
a golden opportunity in that trust to make sure that the next generation is protected for their lifetime against divorce, against lawsuits that come against them, so that the money stays in the family. Simply put, our job is to keep wealth in the family. That's what we do, and we want to keep it in there for generations to come.
Yeah, great stuff, Brent. I mean, I could have a million more questions. We can't get to everything here today, but obviously, love to have you back on to further this discussion and dive deeper into some of these concepts. So my kind of takeaway from you is do some pre-planning, understand what asset protection is for the business, personal, how it integrates with estate planning, yeah. I mean, any last kind of key points you want to make?
Yeah, I would say, the thing that I want to make sure everybody understands here is asset protection planning is great. I mean, we have a situation where, not to go too far into this, but we all know there's a litigation explosion going on.
Right.
90% of all the world's lawsuits, I think something like 3.7% of our GDP in this country are derived from various consequences of lawsuits and such. Don't be a victim to that. Be proactive about it. It takes nothing but time at this stage. So if you have an interest, if any of this stuff shakes you up a bit, probably should. It's very important to meet with a lawyer, talk about what's going on. We do complimentary consultations, and I love when people come in and say, what do we do? How do we fix the situation? And the starting point is generally, let's do a blueprint analysis. Let's see
Right.
everything.
Yeah.
Let's look at everything. It's equivalent to going and getting your full body scan at the doctor and pointing out where all the issues are. And then we decide together, what of these things do we care about? What do we not? How do we inexpensively fix these things and make you where you're protected so you can sleep at night and not worry about that day that may or may not come. So I would
Yeah.
say that's a good parting thing to do if you have the time to do it.
Yeah, it's a great takeaway. And for those who may have missed it early on the screen, if you text guard assets to that number, that gets you one-on-one with Brent for a complimentary session. And no issue is too small or too big. It's asset protection, estate planning, business planning. Brent is an expert in all those areas. So I encourage you to take advantage of that. Brent, thanks so much. And we will see you next time.
Thanks, Paul.